Hi, Lawrence. You want me to try from my side? I think I can click and record.
It is recording.
Oh yeah, yes, I think she is recording from her side.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So before again I begin the session, I would just like to go over Dr. Joseph Reddy's bio. So Dr. Reddy completed his LLD degree in 2024. He's a member of the Faculty of Law and has been teaching commercial law for the past 10 years. Dr. Joseph is also an admitted attorney, non-practicing. His research interests fall under cyber law, artificial intelligence, and the law and consumer law. Dr. Reddy also sits on the Research Ethics Committee for the Faculty of Education. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dr. Reddy to begin the session. Thank you. You may proceed, Doc.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for that nice
Okay.
introduction. Tell me, can I just share my screen or do I have to take control or can I just share my slides?
Yeah, you can share your screen. I have stopped sharing my screen as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Just let me know because I know sometimes the Wi-Fi drops or the slide stops sharing or my mic gets muted. So just let me know if there are any of those issues.
Okay, we'll let you know. Thank you.
Yay. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this Thursday morning. I am Dr. Reddy, as was introduced in the introduction. I'm actually not the go-to person in the Faculty of Law. It's actually Professor Unita Carlett. She's the Vice Dean of Research, but she's kindly provided me with the information that I am going to deliver to you today. If you do have any queries, you can also contact Tembakazi, who is part of the law faculty, the faculty officer in terms of the postgraduate department. But I'm here for you to share some tricks and some, I think, methods to really focus on in terms of your thesis format and your procedures. So I've done quite a bit of internal assessment as well as external assessment in the last few years. And I've picked up on a couple of tricks that you really should work out or you should really include in your own writing. And obviously, completing my own doctorate, I've picked up a few suggestions and ways in terms of which you should try and proceed. And actually, recently, there's been a bit of changes in terms of the master's format and procedures. So I'll go through those and tell you what is the old procedure and what is the new procedure. Now, what I'm going to discuss, and I know it is a 2-hour session, but I think if I talk for 2 hours, you may get really bored and you may want to deregister from your qualification. So I'll probably talk for an hour and then we'll do questions. As the moderator did indicate, if you do have a burning question, you can please interrupt me and I'll address the question. Otherwise, we can deal with it at the end. So we're going to talk about just very basically your duties of the supervisor, the duties of the student, generally what is surrounding the whole thesis or the dissertation, and then constructing your actual writing. Now, the first thing that you really need to focus on before you even find a supervisor is to find a topic. And I think sometimes this is really underestimated because we get students who come to us and they say, I don't have a topic. Please, sir, can you find a topic for me? Now, it shouldn't be something that your supervisor gives to you. It should be something that you want to write upon and, you know, it's an interest to you and it's something that you think is probably relevant. So when the markers get your dissertation or receive your assessment, they look at all of these things here that are on the slides, besides the last one, which I'll talk about just now. So they're looking at whether it's an original contribution, whether it is a relevant topic, and then obviously aesthetically, you're looking at format, spelling, grammar, your structure, your reading, reasoning, and your editing and technical finishing. In terms of originality, for masters, it doesn't have to be an original contribution. And I think that's sometimes where students really panic. They think, but this topic has already been written on extensively, and therefore I can't write on this topic. And that's not entirely correct. So although originality is an aspect that is looked at in terms of assessment, it's not cast in stone that it has to be an entirely original idea. So you can take, for example, um, democracy. That was a theme this year, and you can write on that. But obviously, you have to have a viewpoint. So I don't know, for example, maybe freedom of expression. You could say, or freedom of expression online, whether there is such a thing as the right to freedom of expression versus whether or not the internet is being censored. So you have to have the arguments for and against, and then you have to have your own viewpoint. So not entirely a new or novel concept, but something that you are adding to the topic. So by you giving your viewpoints, your justifications, then yes, that is how you are making the topic original. But it doesn't have to be something that is completely new. For a doctorate, yes, it has to be where you are making an original contribution through your, what they call it is a significant intellectual original contribution to the law. So obviously for a doctoral candidate, the threshold is quite high then compared to a master's. And it has to be something that is original and where you are giving your viewpoints and, in fact, recommendations to either change the law or to provide recommendations to the law. So obviously for masters and doctorate, it's quite different. In terms of relevant, you have to really, in your problem statement or in your introduction, you need to paint a picture for your assessor and you really need to grip the attention of your examiners as to why this is such an important topic. Now, it obviously depends on the area of law that you are talking about, but you can't just say, I'm talking about democracy, or I'm talking about freedom of expression, and then the examiner thinks, well, this has been written about quite a lot. So you really need to grip the attention of your examiner. And then you'll see later on, we'll talk about the format, how it's set out, because that has changed recently. So I will explain that to you, what the new process is. Spelling and grammar, I think we really can't harp on about this, but I can go on and on to tell you that even in the final documents that we receive for examinations as an internal and an external, to see spelling and grammar mistakes, it's such a big red flag to say that the student has not gone through the work thoroughly and the supervisor as well. Now, the supervisor is actually not responsible for spelling and grammar. It's really up to the student. And I think that is where we have all the resources in UJ that can help you with spelling and grammar and in terms of your writing, your reasoning, all of that stuff. Use of sources, very, very important. For law, it's really based on primary sources. So that would be your legislation as probably one of the primary sources and your case law, very important. And then if you can't find anything in those primary sources for South African literature, then you have to then go to your journal articles and your textbooks. So that's your secondary sources. Now, internet sources, I know a lot of people say, well, it's quicker and it's easier to access, but please be very careful. The examiners, what they do is they like to look at your bibliography to see how much research did you do and is it extensive enough to award you your master's or obviously your doctorate. Now, with your doctorate, it's written over so many numbers of years, so you would have more time to do research. But with a master's, generally you have 1 year or 6 months, depending on what you've registered for, to write this dissertation. And in that time, really, there is a research phase where you have to collect the data and then you have to read through it and then you have to write. So sometimes people, even if it's just one line, they just put in a reference or footnote there, and then yes, you include that in your bibliography. And the examiners typically look for what are the primary sources. Why did you use a secondary source when in fact there is a primary source that can be used, especially for internet sources as well. So if you Google something and it's an article that's been written by a law firm, but meanwhile there is an accredited article from an accredited journal that has written on that topic as well, the examiners will write back in the assessment form and in feedback and ask you, why did the student go to the internet when there is a perfectly good source in an accredited journal, or there is a case judgment that has spoken about or written about the same issue. So you have to be very careful in terms of your use of sources and focus on your primary sources. Obviously, journal articles and books are accepted, but I would say try to focus on your primary sources. Yes, you can use other theses and other dissertations that have been written by other students and other candidates. However, I would suggest looking at their references. What did they use to write their research, and look at their their use of sources. So that will help a lot. Your structure is very important, and I'll go through that just now. It's no longer in chapter format. It's more of an article format, and I'll explain to you when you move along. And then your reasoning, it has to be logical. So does your introduction align with your conclusion? Is there prominent themes throughout? Is it coherent, cogent? And I think the writing centers can really help you with that. And then your editing and technical finishing. Now you'll see that each faculty has their own sort of agreements with supervisors and students. The editing and technical finishing is not part of the supervisor's job. It's really up to the student to do. And I think that's also where the writing centers can really help you with in terms of editing and technical finishing and your overall English spelling and grammar. But I know that there's a lot of pullback from examiners when they see something and they say this is not written very well. And as a lawyer, your writing and your reading skills are obviously very important. So other than your verbal communication, the other half of your job comes down to writing. So it has to be done and drafted very well. And your footnotes especially has to align, your table of contents has to align. I know I've seen in the past a lot of people when they say please refer to footnote 2, and it doesn't actually correlate to what you are referring to. So you have to go back, and remember your supervisor is always going to give you feedback, and you may chop and change, and when you do that, your footnotes change. So where you were referring to footnote 23, it's now moved to footnote 30, but you haven't actually changed that in the footnotes. And when the examiner is going back and forth, it doesn't correlate. So it's going to be a big issue. Ethical clearance it has to be done before you're actually doing the research. It doesn't usually apply to the law department, but if it is something that requires ethical clearance, then yes, you have to get it before you start actually doing the research. And then that will be sent to the relevant research ethics committee, as well as probably the faculty higher degrees committee or the dean's committee for approval. So just make sure if it is something that requires ethical clearance, that you do get the clearance before you engage in the research. You can't do it after the fact, because then obviously if you didn't get clearance, what you've done is technically unlawful. Now the structure has now changed. Last year, it used to be between 10 to 12,000 words. It's now been reduced to 8,000 words minimum to a maximum of 10,000 words. I know in the past, examiners used to complain where it was above 12,000, because remember, it is a minor dissertation for a master's level. If it is a full dissertation, I stand corrected, but to my knowledge, it was up to 80,000 words. And then for a doctorate, if I'm not mistaken, it used to be around 200,000 words, but really, I think it's more what you say for a doctorate than, the amount of words. But for a minor dissertation, they are quite strict. So if it's anything less than 8,000 words, they will indicate to you, or your supervisor should indicate to you that you have not engaged in the correct word count and you haven't done an extensive research on the topic. If it's more than 10,000 words, sometimes it is accepted, but I would really guard against making it too long, because the examiners will come back to you and say the piece of work was excessively long. And more often than not, when it's over 10,000 words, there's a lot of repetition or unnecessary content that has been included in that dissertation. For the Faculty of Law, you should know it is STAR style. So if you can just do a quick Google search, you'll see the guidelines do come up. It's not complicated, but if you don't know how to do it, it can become very complicated. So in the student supervisor agreement, it is also indicated that the preferred house style is the SAR style. So I would request and I would suggest that students really do acquaint themselves with the SAR style. Also in the library, there are various copies of the journal as well that you can access and you can get a good look at it. Otherwise, you can also go on to, if you have access, well, you should as a UJ student, to JUTA, and then JUTA, you can get electronic copies of SAR as well. So it's no longer in chapter form. So you no longer have a chapter 1 introduction, chapter 2 historical context, chapter 3 body, chapter 4 comparative analysis, chapter 5 conclusion. There's no longer chapters. It's now changed completely. So the new process is as if you are writing an article that is in a journal. So you'd have headings. So you just basically replace the chapters with headings where you would have chapter 1 introduction. All you're doing is now putting a heading number 1 introduction, and then you no longer leave a page in between. Directly underneath the introduction, you would then go into your heading number 2, whatever it could be, common law, legislation, historical background. And then heading number 3, this is what the courts say, or whatever it is. So we no longer do chapters. I'm not sure why it changed, but it just has changed. So it's more in the style of an actual article. Okay, so that's why I say I think looking at the SAR journal would help you a lot, because that gives you a good indication as to how to write an article and aesthetically how it looks. So introduction, your body of writing, comparative analysis, and then your conclusion. Now, in terms of supervisors, that's obviously once you've really found your topic. And by now, I'm hoping everybody does have a topic and you should have a supervisor. If not, please get one as soon as possible because time is running out for submission. You can have more than one supervisor. And especially in terms of law, there's a lot of, we all know law is multidisciplinary. So it doesn't affect one area. It can affect many different areas of the law. And that lecturer may not be an expert in one particular area. So you'd have to find more than one supervisor. And it is quite common where there are more than one supervisors. So you would generally look for an expert in the field. And I say this because sometimes, students can't find supervisors and then they are just allocated one and that person is not entirely an expert. So you may not find someone who's an expert, but they have to have some knowledge in the field. Okay, you can't get someone who is completely out of it's out of their research area, because that's going to be detrimental not only to the supervisor but also to the student, because then the supervisor cannot supervise you to their full potential, and then the student will also not be getting the correct feedback, or will not be getting, the best possible supervision. So you really need to find someone who is either an expert or who has knowledge in that field. And if there is more than one supervisor, then those supervisors really need to work together and to make sure that they are aligned in terms of supervision. Where there are differences between the supervisors, they have to work them out, those issues out between themselves, and then obviously clarify and communicate to the student. This is the way forward. If there has been a bit of an argument or a bit of a difference in terms of the way that it should be approached. Just a quick difference between the roles of supervisors in terms of masters and doctorates. For masters, basically, the supervisor is supposed to lead the master's candidate into what they are supposed to do and the outcome of the dissertation. Whereas in a doctoral thesis, it's supposed to be, as I said, a significant intellectual original contribution, and it's your own impact that you've made. The supervisor is just there to guide you, but you as the doctoral candidate, you have become an expert in that field. And from experience, I can tell you my supervisor was very hands-on. I was lucky to have a very good supervisor in terms of my doctorate, but she kept telling me, you are the expert in terms of what you are writing on. Even though I looked for her knowledge and expertise. She said it's really up to you for your doctorate to become to make an original contribution. So she did give very comprehensive feedback, but at the end of the day, it's up to you as the candidate to know what you are writing on, and you are becoming, as it says in the slides, the frontier of your discipline or that specific field. So for masters, yes, the supervisor is the one who is generally the expert in the field. They will lead you and guide you, and they can't write the dissertation for you. Obviously, it's still up to you to write it, and they will tell you whether or not you're on the right or wrong path and what should be changed. Whereas in terms of doctorate, it's more you making your own significant contribution. Now, after you've met your supervisor, so you found someone who's competent enough to guide you, you would then need to prepare a research proposal. And the proposal can take a bit of time. So please, take some time and don't just rush it. Don't think it can be done within a week, because then your supervisor will know that it's been prepared quite haphazardly, quickly. It can be very sloppy as well, and you're just putting it together for the sake of putting it together. And the reason why I suggest working on it and taking your time is because that proposal is really something that you go back to throughout your writing process. So that will also form part of your introduction, but there may be themes that you would take in not chapters, no longer chapters, in heading number 2 or in your conclusion as well. So it is advised in the supervisor-student agreement that it should be of not less than 4,000 words. And remember, altogether, you're supposed to have 8,000 words or more. So if you've done this proposal in a proper fashion and in a proper manner, then you've already done half the work. And the whole point of this proposal is to give it to your supervisor, and your supervisor will be able to determine whether or not you actually have a good research dissertation or a good doctorate that you are going to write out, and you actually have content to write about. I remember when I started my doctorate, there was not a lot of research on it. And because of that, we had to rely on a lot of other countries in terms of comparative analysis. But by the time I finished, the field developed so quickly that there was a lot of information and I had to go back and add everything. So just make sure that you do have a topic where there is information that you can write on. And otherwise, you're going to really struggle, and examiners will say, but this is done more from a personal perspective rather than looking at the existing sources and literature. So the trick there is, if you can't find any authority or any sources in South African literature or South African law, you then look for a comparative analysis, and that gives you the benefit of writing or providing recommendations and proposals for South African law. But anyway, to jump back, the proposal basically sets out your aim and purpose of the research, indicating to the reader, which is basically your supervisor, or it could go to the Faculty Higher Degrees Committee, what the existing knowledge is or what the existing literature is on this subject matter, why it is a problem, and what are you proposing to change. So it's basically a summary of what you are going to discuss, and it also gives the reader an indication as to whether or not you have the necessary skills to proceed with a master's or to proceed with a doctorate. So sometimes that proposal is kept on record, and the faculty or the supervisor can request to see what have you worked on, and whether or not you are fit for the purposes of the intended research. So the proposal is very important. You will definitely come back to that research proposal when you are writing. You may even change it and edit it as you go along, which is fine. But at least if you have that skeleton, it will help you as you proceed with writing your research. Okay, the agreement is very important, and if you don't have a copy, because you should have one, it has to be signed by both the student and the supervisor. Please request one from the faculty. It provides academic guidance for both the student and the supervisor. So the faculty officer is supposed to furnish you with those documents. And then once you've signed that agreement, it actually tells the faculty for noting what is the actual topic. So the title, Who is the student, student name, student number, and what are they registered for? Is it a master's, a LLM, or is it a doctorate and LLD? And then who are the examiners? Now, the examiners are not appointed at the time that you decide your topic. During the course of writing, your supervisor is tasked with finding those examiners. Now, on the point of examiners, for a master's dissertation, usually it's only two examiners. One would be an internal examiner from the Faculty of Law, so someone in the law department. The external examiner is someone that is outside the faculty. So that is to ensure, obviously, for ethical reasons as well, to ensure that people internally are not just pushing out students. I've given this to a colleague of mine who I know is going to pass the student in terms of their masters. Okay, I'm not saying that happens, but that is the reason why we have more or different examiners. And ethically, an external party who's got no interest, who doesn't know the student, is an expert in the subject matter as well. They would be able to give an impartial and an independent and fair assessment. So the examiners are really a job for the supervisor to find. It shouldn't be someone that the student has recommended, because then that would be a conflict of interest. And it is someone who is an expert in the field, more of an expert than probably an internal candidate. Because remember, the internal can't be your supervisor. It has to be someone else. And your supervisor is generally the expert in the area. So the internal candidate in terms of the law faculty would be someone who has knowledge in the field or in the topic, but won't be an expert such as your supervisor. It could be if there is more than one person who is an expert, but usually it is someone who has knowledge in the area, whereas the external examiner is also a true expert like your supervisor and would probably be able to give a fair and better assessment. So that's for masters. For doctorate, it's a minimum of 3 examiners, and it's usually two, no, is it two? Yes, it's 2 local and 1 international examiner, minimum. Okay, so 2 national people in South Africa, examiners, and then 1 international examiner from any other institution that is outside of South Africa. That is for doctorate. Now, the examiners, and I've just learned this recently, they don't have to be someone who is an academic. They can be experts in their field in terms of industry or, lawyers, but usually it is someone from another academic institution. That's the usual practice, but it doesn't have to be. But as I say, it's not something for students to understand. I'm just explaining to you what the process and procedures are in terms of appointing examiners. Those examiners will be sent to the faculty, and they will decide whether or not they are appropriate to assess the dissertation or the doctorate. Now, in terms of actually meeting with your supervisor, the agreement says once every 4 weeks, which equates to once a month, at least a bare minimum. Okay, you need to keep a record. The agreement does say that it has, or it should be, it's urged or suggested that meetings are done on the university premises. But what I've noted from experience is that some of the students are working and it doesn't align with our timetable. So when the student is done after work, sometimes the lecturers are not here after 5 o'clock and it's very difficult to meet. So obviously online via Teams or Zoom or any other online platform, even WhatsApp calls can be appropriate. As long as you have a meeting with your student and your supervisor, it should be fine. And beforehand, discuss what you want to talk about. You can't just make it a 5-minute discussion. Discuss what you want to talk about. Is it about a particular heading, a particular section of the dissertation? What is it? Is it research that you can't find? That just gives the supervisor time. If it is research related, then the supervisor could possibly help you out with finding research that you are finding difficult to access. Keep access of all communications, because sometimes the supervisor will say, I haven't received your section that you've written on, and meanwhile you did send it to the supervisor, or the supervisor will contact you and say, you haven't sent it to me. And then at least we have these email communications, for any proof that it has been sent. So just to make sure that you have any copies that are required for any proof. As I said, the supervisor is supposed to guide the student. You must also make sure that you write according to the rules. So plagiarism, I will touch on that very quickly just now. And then any changes that are proposed by the assessor, that you actually implement those changes if you believe they are useful. So for a master's, remember, the supervisor is an expert. So I would say, yes, if they've given you a suggestion, a comment, or a change, that you would implement that. However, in terms of a doctorate, and I know specifically with my supervisor, she would put a question mark next to it and say, do you agree with this? Because you are the expert in terms of a doctorate. So it doesn't mean that you have to accept it blindly and follow the instructions. It just depends on what the comment or what the suggestion is, and then you should discuss that with your supervisor in terms of deciding whether or not it is a relevant change. Feedback, and this is very important, and I think students sometimes get frustrated as to why the supervisor has not given feedback timeously. So in terms of our faculty's agreement, it is 2 weeks. So if you send me something today, I've got 2 weeks in which I can read it, do my research, provide comments, and give it back to you. You can't expect to submit it today and for me to give you feedback on Monday. And a lot of students, they leave it for the last minute, and then they'll send it on a Friday evening, and they'll expect the lecturer or whoever it is, the professor, doctor, to give them feedback on the weekend so they can do changes. And that's really unacceptable. In terms of the agreement, it is a minimum or maximum of 14 days. In terms of a section, I put section / chapter because it used to be a chapter. So if you send me heading or section number 2 and it's 5 to 10 pages or whatever it is, I have 2 weeks in which I can give you feedback. And generally, I can say depending on the workload of the supervisor, it's generally done before that 14-day period. However, there can be a request for a longer time if there are other work constraints. If it is the final draft, okay, this is very important. So you've done everything, all your headings, introduction, table of contents, bibliography. It's 4 weeks for the final draft. So 4 weeks, that's 1 month. And remember, the timelines for submission, I'll go through it just now. It comes very quickly. So for most of you, you have to have been done by now if you want your supervisor to give you 4 weeks of feedback. Um, so it is actually not a lot of time that you have to write because the feedback takes quite a long time as well. Again, you can't expect if you're sending a full draft to get feedback within 2 or 3 days or even 1 or 2 weeks. It's possibly going to take 3 to 4 weeks to get feedback. Um, and I think the important thing here is because of the change of format, it's no longer chapters, it's no longer chapter 1 to 5. It's now actually a single chapter because it is in article format. So if you're giving that whole article to your supervisor, they are going to take 1 month to get back to you because that's how long it's going to take to provide feedback and to make sure they verify your sources, verify what you have said as well. The supervisor can also extend and ask for a request for an extension of 2 months, which I think is not ideal because of the time limits that you have in which you need to submit your actual dissertation. If it is obviously a doctorate and it's over a number of years, then yes, it could be a bit easier. But for a dissertation, you don't have a lot of time to write it, and you're going to run out of time if you have to wait 2 months to get feedback. For the student, you must acquaint yourself with the rules and policies of the faculty. So it's not only the agreement, it's obviously the plagiarism document that is available on the internet as well, the rules and procedures of the university, anything like that. So make sure that you do abide by those rules. And in terms of the agreement, you agree to do your own work. So you can't expect the supervisor to write anything for you. It's a master's by yourself. You are registered as a student. The supervisor is just there to lead you and to guide you. Okay, so the proposal, as I say, is very important, but it's still the sole responsibility of the student to write their own research and make sure that they do the work. In terms of finances, and this is a process that has come up quite often, it's not for your supervisor to pay for your research. Okay, it's your responsibility to make sure that you can complete your research. If you don't submit on time, so you haven't followed the correct process, and you miss the deadline, then there are financial implications, which I will speak to later on when I talk about submission deadlines. But remember, you can't come to your supervisor and say, well, you took 1 week when I asked you to please give me the feedback within 3 days, and blame it on your supervisor to say that they haven't abided by your own terms and conditions. Language editing, as I've said, very important. It's not the process of the supervisor to do language editing. And I know a lot of examiners, the first thing they do when they come back with changes is they actually suggest, please go see someone for language editing. In the document, the student agreement document, it is actually stated there that the student must provide their own finances for editing. I know some supervisors do help out there if they do have the means to, but often it's just left up to the student to make sure that it is language edited before submission, not only to the supervisor, but obviously to the examiners, to make sure that at least it reads well and it actually looks and reads quite nicely for the examiners. Your student agreement with your supervisor, it will have or should have an agreed schedule, or it could be on a case-by-case basis where, for example, if you need to speak about a specific topic, then you can contact your supervisor, or the supervisor should have regular check-ins. Remember, once a month is minimum. I like to have once every 2 weeks with my students, or even just pop a quick email into them, touch base with them. How's it going? What are you struggling with? What can I help you with? So please don't feel like you are alone on the journey, because it shouldn't be like that. Your supervisor is the one who's supposed to guide you and lead you. Although you are tasked with writing it, your supervisor can give you obviously suggestions and recommendations as to where you are going wrong and what you are doing right. Students are required to be reasonable. You can't have unreasonable requests. And as I say, meetings are supposed to happen on the university premises, but for convenience sake, it's most often than not done online via Teams or Zoom. Very important relating to plagiarism is Turnitin. Okay, and this generally happens once you have a draft. And I would suggest that you only do it after you have a draft. Don't do it section by section, because as you know, or you should know, with Turnitin, if you send in the same document multiple times, it would pick up that you've actually plagiarized your own work because you've submitted it before. So you have to be careful of the settings that you indicate on Turnitin. And we are fortunate enough that via Moodle, Turnitin is one of the plugins that you can use there. So if you're having difficulty, there are many workshops that have been done on using Turnitin via Moodle. But you can access it via Moodle, and you can actually insert or upload your own work. And it's very important that you do have a plagiarism report. Okay, the report will tell you, it gives you, different colors as to what is taken direct or direct quotes, what hasn't been referenced. So many students think if I've referenced something, it's not plagiarism. Okay, if it's a direct quote from legislation or from cases or from articles, it has to be placed in quotation marks and it has to be referenced. Okay, you can't just reference 2 pages. Usually it's only a paragraph, and then you comment on why this is so important or why you have included that direct quotation. The similarity report will come back, and usually for master's dissertations, it's very quick. It takes actually a couple of minutes. It has to be less than 20%. Okay, if it's more than 20%, you have to change things around. If it's less than 20%, you can leave it, but usually you send that similarity report to your supervisor, and then the procedure from there is that your supervisor goes through that plagiarism report to make sure and to decide what should be changed and what shouldn't be changed. So even if it is less than 20%, the supervisor will see, but look, you've taken 2 paragraphs, and generally it shouldn't be 2 paragraphs, it should be 1 paragraph that is quoted. or you could just separate it and put it in two different paragraphs or whatever it is. So they would look at what the report picks up. Sometimes the report is quite ridiculous because it picks up, for example, and the I am the, all of that. So in your Moodle settings, what you'll do is you can actually restrict the settings or what it would pick up. So you could say don't pick up the first 5 words of a sentence because then it picks up common phrases or common words that are generally used when we are writing. So for example, if you say I submit that the following is an incorrect process, it would pick up that statement as plagiarism when you are making a submission yourself. So you can tweak the settings in terms of Turnitin to say that you're not considering the first 5 words or so. And obviously, if it's more than 5 words and it picks it up, then you know you've taken a direct quote without actually looking at quotation marks. Do it on time. And the reason why I say this, especially for a doctorate, if you submit, so you've done it the first time and you've got a similarity report of 30%. And then next week you've done changes and you want to submit again via Turnitin. You have to make sure that you disregard previous submissions, but if you can't do that on the settings and you submit again, it may pick up that your previous or your next submission is going to be plagiarism because you've already done the submission. And what can happen is if you've done it more than once, so if you submit on Turnitin for the third or second time, it actually takes longer to give you a report. I'm not sure why, but it does that. So I know some of my students, it used to take 48 hours to give a report. So you have to make sure that you do it timelessly and you have to make sure that it is less than 20%. The other thing relating to plagiarism is I get a lot of questions on can I use, for example, AI in terms of my research and my writing? So there's a lot of applications like Grammarly to check for grammar. ChatGPT, is the hot debate at the moment, whether you are allowed to use it. The answer is yes and no. So we don't advise using ChatGPT because it's not a legal expert. You can just put it in there and say, please write this or give me a scenario, and it can write for you. There has been an instance overseas where someone used ChatGPT to write their doctorate, but I'll talk about that later on when you come into examinations. And we really don't encourage using ChatGPT. If you do use it for a small section, you have to read what has been written by ChatGPT to make sure that what is there has been made sense. So you'll know there was a case earlier, I think it was last year, beginning of this year, where a attorney relied on ChatGPT to write the heads of argument, and then ChatGPT actually made up cases and made up facts. And when it went to court, the magistrate or the judge said, this actually doesn't exist. So you got to be very careful when you are using those platforms. And I would strongly suggest that you use them with caution. Okay, review of the work. What is the process there? A maximum of, what is this talking about? Oh, reviewing. So usually when it is done section by section, once you have done those changes, generally there shouldn't be any more changes when you are done with the section. However, sometimes when you've done with the first draft, the supervisor could say, okay, but section 2 doesn't really align with what you've said in section 4. So just make sure that the two relate to each other and that it is coherent. Because remember, they're looking at whether or not it is coherent and it does flow logically from section to section. If you're writing your doctorate, then it does flow chapter to chapter. What is nice and what used to be nice when we did a chapter format for dissertations was there used to be a mini summary at the end of each chapter that builds on the next chapter. But for now that you're writing an article, what you would do is at the end of section or heading 2, you would say, okay, I've now talked about X, Y, and Z legislation, and this relates to now what I'm going to talk to in section 3, which is the issue of ABC. So you just need to make sure that it flows nicely from one heading to the next heading. It's the duty of the student to make sure that all the changes done by the supervisor or made by the supervisor are incorporated into the agreement. It's nice if it's done in track changes because if there are, for example, any grammatical, and remember, it's not the supervisor's responsibility to do grammatical changes, but if there are, then you can just accept those changes, which is quite nice. When I first started, my supervisor used to make me print out the chapters of my doctorate, and then she used to write on the actual printout the changes, and then it became too difficult, so we swapped to track changes. Track changes generally would have, markups that you would need to change, or it would have comments for you to look at. For example, please consider this case, please look at this legislation, or this is disjointed, it's not making sense. Please clarify this point that you've made, or whatever it is. So those track changes and those comments are quite useful. And you also have then proof of the changes that you have incorporated. So you need to obviously proofread your own work. It's not there for the supervisor to proofread. It's for you to do all those changes, and it's your responsibility. Okay, generally, I think we've discussed this, but have you done enough research? Because again, your sources that you've used, are there enough sources that you have, primary sources? Keep a paper trail of everything that you have, because the faculty can always request information from you as well. Is it your own research? Have you relied on only what your supervisor has told you, or have you done your own research? Because sometimes there are new developments that have just recently occurred, and the supervisor may not be aware of it because of their own work schedule. That is something that you would need to investigate and obviously include. And then you could also notify your supervisor to say, please, this is new. Have you heard about it? What should I include it, or should I not include it? And I think sometimes students panic because they think there's something new and it actually doesn't relate to their topic at all. And they're just trying to include it in there because they're worried that it could be a new development that they haven't looked at. Again, SAR style, look at the SAR guidelines, very useful in terms of how to write an article and the headings that you would need in your dissertation. General checklist that you would need just to cover what we discussed. Identifying a topic, okay, ensure that the topic has not been covered yet. That's a yes and no, because remember, it doesn't have to be entirely original. If it is a topic that has been covered, as I said, you would then give your own spin on it. You would say what point of view you are taking, or how you have differed from the previous writings. Okay, research proposal. There is no template that I actually have there, but just looking at your introduction, what are the issues, your problem statement, that you are going to discuss, and then proposals and recommendations that you are going to make. Your editorial style is going to be in the star style. Have a timetable as for each section that you are going to write. So sometimes I know students really don't stick to that timetable, because if you're working, it's very difficult to work and do research. But as much as possible, you need to adhere to those timelines, because your supervisor also has their own timelines. Actually writing out the dissertation with the assistance of your supervisor and discussing your progress. You may go back and forth, but ultimately you should be moving forward. And then have time, as I said, for editing, to check with the writing centers, or if you've got a professional editor that you know that you have to pay for, then make sure you have time, because those professional editors will also take up a lot of your time. They may not come back within 1 or 2 days. I was lucky enough with my doctorate, it came back within 2 weeks. But for some people, they could be booked out and they could take a month. So you have to make sure you have enough time for editing. Okay, revise your structure, make sure everything flows properly, and then also comply with the university regulations, which I'll talk about just now. And then you submit for assessment. Now, this I'm not going to go through because we've talked about this, but your bibliography is quite important. I think that's the only thing I haven't really touched on. It's usually done in alphabetical order, but it's broken down in terms of primary sources, so legislation and case law, and then your secondary sources, which would then be your journal articles and your books. Internet sources, as I said, I would guard against using that primarily. I think for some topics such as cyber law and AI, sometimes internet sources are there are quite a bit of them, but you will see there are journals, open access journals, that publish as they receive submissions. So there may be something in that journal. So you need to check constantly, has there been an update in that journal? So rather than using the internet, I would say use a journal article or a book. And if you can't and it's a last resort, then you can include that internet source. Okay, example of a structure for your actual dissertation would be your introduction, what is the topic about, and then the problem statement, this is what the issue is with the law, and my aim and my methodology in terms of my research. You then go through the body of essay law and case law or journal articles. You would then make your recommendation and conclusion and have your own bibliography. So this is just really a very scarce and broad example of what a structure looks like, but I think it's very important. You have to have a strong problem statement. Okay, you have to say why you are writing this topic, what is the problem, and what are you proposing to solve it. Okay, or recommendations for proposals. So if that is not clear from the get-go, then it's going to be an issue throughout the writing or throughout the dissertation. And I know examiners come back and they say, we couldn't identify what was the issue, or there were too many issues that were identified. I think the student was a bit too broad. So you got to be very careful in being too broad and being too restrictive. And it's really up to you to decide what is that fine line between you and your supervisor. So make sure that the statement and your introduction is very strong and you have a clear issue or clear problem that you are identifying and what is your aim and objectives of the research. Also make sure that your conclusion and recommendations align with the introduction. You would always go back to that introduction. So you may think, okay, I've done it for now. I'm done with my introduction and my problem statement. I can then move on. Once you are done with the recommendations and conclusion, you would always go back to make sure that what you've said at the end aligns to what you said in the beginning. And obviously, if it's not, it's going to be disjointed. The examiner is going to come back and say the dissertation does not make sense. It's not logical. It doesn't flow from what you have said. So I know at the end of examining, the examiners definitely go back and read the introduction again, and then they read the conclusion to make sure that what you have said does relate to the beginning of your thesis or your dissertation. So please make sure that it does make sense. This is taken from someone else's, so this is a good example as to how it would look in terms of table and contents. I would advise to have a table of contents because it aids the examiner at the end as well as when they're reading to navigate your dissertation. Obviously, if it's doctored as well and it's quite a lot of pages, then it will be obviously beneficial to have this table of contents. So it's not a hard and fast rule. I've seen some people who don't have a table of contents, and then the examiners have suggested that it should be included. And to me, I always suggest to my students, please put in a table of contents. When you do that, please make sure that the page numbers align to the contents. Okay, so if you're putting in there, for example, heading number 4, remedies, and you say it's on page 24, the examiner goes there and meanwhile it's on page 30, they're already going to be frustrated and they're going to send it back for changes. So just make sure that all of those numbers are aligned to the actual headings. And make sure that you do have time because this is a very tedious task. And this took me for my doctorate about 2 to 3 weeks. I left it to the end and I was foolish. Don't leave it to the end, even your bibliography. As you are writing, put things in your bibliography. So at the end, you know you've got everything there and you can just alphabetize it. Okay, don't leave it to the end. Maybe the table of contents you have to leave at the end because of page numbers, but it can be a very tedious task and you need to make sure that you have enough time to go through and make sure you have enough time to actually write out the table of contents and your bibliography. Evaluation as to content, as I've said, it says there in the bold, you don't have to make an original or fundamental contribution to their field unless it is a doctorate. Okay, so if it is a doctorate, then yes, you are going to have be an expert in that. But if not, we're just looking at, are you a master of your topic? in terms of a dissertation? Do you demonstrate enough proficiency for the research and the ability to work independently as well as with your supervisor? Okay, so as it says in the last paragraph, master's graduates are expected to exhibit mastery of research. Okay, you have the ability to understand how to find not only find research, but the ability to rewrite it in your own words and make a contribution that is showing something evident enough of writing something in your own words. This is just straight from the student and supervisors agreement, so I'm not going to go through it. It doesn't really talk about the process and procedure, but it's just what they are looking at, okay, high level of knowledge on the research topic, demonstrating the ability to reflect on other people's work and write something meaningful. And as I said, relevance is very important. If it's not meaningful and it doesn't have impact, then it may be something that is not a meaningful contribution. So you just have to make sure that you are writing something that is relevant. That would go towards your problem statement and the objectives and proposals that you're going to write at the end of your dissertation. Assessment. So this is what the examiners look at. Okay, relevance of the topic. Okay, how relevant is it? Uses of sources. I did talk about it in the beginning. Is it logical and does it reason well? Justifiability of conclusions. Are you just justifying it yourself or have you relied on existing literature? Okay, so have you relied on legislation? Have you relied on the case law? How are you justifying these conclusions, or is it just based on your own sort of, suggestions and submissions? And then language use and editing, you'll see it comes up quite often. So I'm hoping that you would go for language editing. At the end, obviously, once you've done everything, you would need to go through everything again. Do you think the topic is fine? Obviously, you can't in the last hour say, I actually don't think the topic is relevant anymore. Make sure you read, and that should be done right at the beginning. You have enough sources that you're going to include. Problem statement, problem statement, problem statement. Have you actually answered the problem and the issues that you've highlighted in the beginning? Limit your scope. Don't make it too broad, as I've said, and also don't make it too restrictive that you don't have enough to write on. And then follow the STAR style structure, and then you should be fine. So those are the golden procedures that will assist you in terms of completing your dissertation. Just an example, and this was sent from Prof. Carl, it's an example of what should be included in the writing. So for example, my aim is to provide a contribution that is discussing blah, 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 X, Y, and Z. The analysis will include proposals, submissions, conclusions, recommendations, guidelines, whatever it is. Now, I've highlighted there in the beginning comparative study. And the question I usually get is it compulsory to have a comparative analysis in my dissertation? And the answer is no. However, I always urge students to write a comparative or to include a comparative analysis. Remember, you are restricted to 10,000 words. So it doesn't have to be a long comparative analysis, but at the same time, it can't just be half a page because it's not going to really make sense. It's not going to give enough essence to what you are writing. The in either the first way is that it's showing what other countries have done. South Africa should follow a similar approach. So you're telling the examiner, this has worked in the US or the UK, or whichever country it is. And therefore, I believe because South Africa doesn't have legislation on this, they should follow the similar approach in the EU. Okay. Or the other is I don't know, Canada has or Australia has these laws. These laws have not worked or subject to a lot of criticism. There's been a lot of redrafting, or there's been a lot of constitutional, pullback from these laws. And therefore, this is a lesson to South Africa not to follow this approach. And I would advise South Africa to do the following. So your comparative analysis is really looking at what works for SA and what doesn't work for SA. You can't just say, yes, I agree, everything that the other country has done, they should do, or everything that that the country has done, we shouldn't do the same thing. So that is really looking at, are you a master now? Have you become a researcher that understands this works, this doesn't work, this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do. And that really shows the examiner that you have the ability to do your research and to write in a very logical manner. And that's, I think, the great research dissertations that I've seen where students have really got a distinction is where they have said, this is what works in one country. However, South Africa should consider doing this. We've done it this way. Therefore, we should change it looking like that. So it's really for you to get these arguments and decide what should be the recommendation, what should be the interpretation in the future. Okay, it can't just be, yes, freedom of expression is good and we should keep it the way it is. That's not what a master's is about. It is about engaging in the research and coming up with your own sort of original outcome. It doesn't have to be an original contribution, but you're coming out with your own original idea at the end. So I think that is very important. So I do suggest a comparative analysis, but again, depending on your word count and depending on your topic, it may not be relevant. Okay, so it's not compulsory, but I do suggest it. Submission deadlines, very, very important. For the first semester, it is usually the 31st of May, and this is also subject to change, but from past experience, this is the usual dates. So for this semester, it is the 31st of October. So you can start panicking because that is next month. That is when everything has to be finalized. There's no longer drafts, there's no longer language editing, there's no longer turn it in. You've done everything, you've sent it in PDF and in Word to your supervisor, and your supervisor has sent an email to say, I am happy, you can submit. That is the last date, 31st of October. Now, if you're looking at that date and you're looking at everything else that I've told you in terms of process and procedure, in terms of language editing, feedback from supervisors, that 2 weeks, the 1 month, depending on how long editors take, you are definitely going to run out of time. Okay, so you need to start getting the ball rolling. I would say by the end of September, at least a rough draft is out, so your supervisor can then give you feedback on what you've written, and then you have time to do the changes and send that for language editing or whatever it is. Because remember, depending on the writing center, how busy they are, sometimes you can't just think today, okay, I'm going to book them today, I'll get an appointment tomorrow. They're also very busy, so you need to make sure you have enough time for the writing centers to accommodate you. In terms of examiners' feedback, examiners get usually 6 weeks to examine, but in practice, the externals take longer. Remember also, it is now coming into exam time at the end of October, so the externals could also be busy with their marking and their examination. So it usually takes 8 weeks, but the faculty office is very competent there. They usually get those reports in and they send reminders to the examiners. So what would happen here in terms of that process is that once you are done and you are relaxing, the examiners have the chance to examine based on all the things that I've talked about, and then they would provide their reports. So for masters, it's two examiners, the internal and the external. The internal is usually quicker than the external, but it just depends who it is. And you have to wait for all the reports. Now, remember, I did say the external is the expert. The external would give you comments on each section, for example, originality, relevance, editing, and technical finishing. You'll see there's sections in the examination form to fill. So if you get changes, and highly likely you will get changes unless it is a groundbreaking and very, very well written dissertation, but 99% of the time it does come back with changes. There are time limits that you need to adhere to. So you need to make sure that you do those changes from the examiners. It depends. The faculty will give you an indication, but usually it's within, depending on the changes, it's usually 2 to 3 weeks in which you need to do those changes. Okay, so if there is no time limit, you just contact the faculty and ask them, how long do I have to do the changes? Also, if it's closer to a graduation date, they will push you to make those changes quickly so you can obviously graduate at a quicker date rather than pushing it to next year. The new thing that I've recently heard about for doctoral candidates is this compulsory oral defense. So once the uh, reports have come in from the examiners to say whether or not you pass or there's changes, there's also now an oral defense that has to be done. We haven't had one yet in the faculty. I think there is one coming up soon. But basically, the oral defense just involves all the three examiners. So the two national examiners and the one international examiner. It involves obviously the doctoral candidate, and then it involves the supervisors. If they are co-supervisors, both of them have to be there. And the oral defense just basically reiterates or reinforces whether or not the student understands what they have written and if they are an expert in the field. So it doesn't apply to master's candidates, it only applies to doctoral candidates. And the reason why they've introduced this is where I told you someone used their ChatGPT to write their PhD, not from this institution, but from overseas. And what happened there was when the student did the oral defense, they found out that the student couldn't answer questions that was actually in the thesis. And then they realized that the student didn't write the thesis himself. It was actually done by AI. Okay, and there's also been instances overseas where people have paid other doctoral candidates have paid other people to write their doctorates for them, or they pay supervisors to write the doctorates for them. So the oral defense is just the next step to ensure that you yourself as a doctoral candidate has actually written the thesis and you are an expert in the field. So it's used for clarification purposes. They'll ask you questions on the research that you have done. They can also pose questions to your supervisor, but the main candidate is obviously the doctoral candidate. If they are divergent examiner reports, so one says yes, it's accepted, and one says no, it's not accepted, then in that sort of meeting, they can also come to a decision as to what would be the way forward. So it is a new thing. It's going to be done online because obviously to accommodate the international examiner. But it is a new thing that is going to be introduced. So just be prepared if you are busy with your doctorate that there would be now an oral defense where you would need to stand up and you would need to speak about your doctorate and answer any questions for the examiners. And then the results that you can get, I think this is important. So once all the processes and procedures have been followed, the best result that you can get is that the dissertation and doctorate has been accepted unconditionally and the following mark is allocated. And as I say, this has probably never ever happened. Maybe once, one or two rare cases where it's accepted by both examiners and there's no changes. The most common, I would say, is the second one is where it is accepted. However, there are changes that are indicated to the satisfaction of the supervisor. So what that means is in each section that is assessed, so for your relevance or your grammar or your structure, your logical reasoning, there will be different comments in that assessment report. And then at the end, the examiner would say, these are my suggested changes, and this is what you need to change, and then you need to implement those changes. Now, when you implement those changes, you don't need to resubmit it for examination. You just have to give it to your supervisor, and your supervisor will read whether or not you have satisfactorily made those changes. So once that is done, the mark that is allocated will be awarded to you, and then that's the end of the matter. The third one is that it's not accepted. However, what has to be done is that there is extensive revision required. So that means that at the moment in time, you haven't passed, but you haven't failed either. You just have to rewrite extensively or revise the dissertation, and then you have to resubmit to the examiners. Okay, so it's not a pass or a fail. It's a resubmission required. So there's a heavy reevaluation and resubmission required. And then the worst one is where it's not accepted and it is failed in its entirety. So that is obviously where the supervisor has not done his or her job, as well as the student, and it's a poor of work ethic, and it's just not done in line with any of the things that I've discussed. That is very rare. I would say the second one is the one that happens the most, but it can happen if you're just very lazy and you haven't met with your supervisor, or you've even submitted without your supervisor's knowledge, and then it comes back with a fail. So I'm hoping that would not happen. But just to tell you, that is the procedure. It can be a fail, but more often than not, it's usually changes to the satisfaction of the supervisor. And in other instances, it can be a resubmission where it's not clear enough, or you haven't actually included the necessary sources of law. And I think that is it from my side. It did take a long time, and I'm sorry. But if there are any questions, please pop it in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. Am I audible enough? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, now thank you so much, Dr. Reddy, for this amazing, workshop and amazing insights, based on this thesis format and submission procedure. I believe, many students struggle with this. And, it was really so insightful for you to avail yourself and, explain to the students, these procedures and all this, because it's really important in their academic journey that they know that you also need to know the academic side of it and the administration side of it. And we really appreciate you so much. And I don't know if there's any question from the participant or any student that would like to pose any questions to Dr. Reddy. You can raise your hand, or you can type the question in the chat box and I can present it to him. If there's anybody with any question, please raise your hand. So in that sense, I believe that there isn't any question for Dr. Eddie. It seems that everything was clear from your side. Doctor, I see there isn't any question in the chat box or any hand raised, and I believe that you were very clear with your presentation. And in
Thank you,
that
Lawrence. I
sense,
just want to take the opportunity to thank you for being the moderator, and obviously thank you to the Research Capacity Development Unit for allowing me this platform to give this presentation. You guys are such a privilege, and it's so nice to work with you guys. Very accommodating and very helpful. So I would really ask the students to reach out to you guys as well for any assistance. But yeah, I really appreciate from my side, and thank you so much. If anybody wants to see me, I really have an open door policy. So if any of the students want to come and chat with me, you're more than welcome to visit, as well as just to pop me an email. But thank you so much from my side to you guys for hosting. It's always such a privilege and honor to be a part of this.
okay, thank you so much, Doctor. I don't know if it's possible, maybe you can just pop your email, then maybe
Yeah,
in the chat box, then they can send you an email rather
sure.
if they have any questions for you.
Sure, I'll do that
Okay.
now.
Okay, perfect. So in that sense, I would like to thank all the attendees again for joining this workshop. And thank you so much again for taking your time, to avail yourself, all the participants. And thank you again. And in that sense, we'll be closing the session. Dr. Ray, if that's fine with you, if there's anything extra that you want to add, I will be ending the session. And
No, no, I'm good. If you guys need anything from me in the future, you just let me know.
okay, no, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy, again. And here at RCD unit, we really appreciate you so much. And thank you to all the participants again. And please note that the recording will be thingy, will be updated on all the model communities together with Dr. Reddy's presentation. He will send it to us and we will be able to update it on all the model communities. And thank you so much again. And please fill in the feedback survey in the chat box, please, to all the participants. And thank you so much again for taking your time, and really appreciate you. And have yourself the rest of the day. Good day. Thank you.